Imagine waking to the relentless drum of rain against the roof. You pull the blanket tighter, check the forecast on your phone, and step into a dry room where wet clothes can be dried and food waits safely in the refrigerator. Even one rainy week can feel miserable. But 50,000 years ago, there were no tiled roofs, raincoats, heaters, or canned food. Caves could flood. Firewood refused to burn. Game animals disappeared, and animal hide clothing stayed cold and soaked. So where did ancient humans protect their fires? What did they eat? And how did entire communities avoid being wiped out? Because rain was never just water falling from the sky. It was a survival test that could last for weeks. But here is the frightening part. Rain usually does not kill by drowning you. It kills by quietly stealing your body heat. Water can pull heat away from the skin roughly 25 times faster than dry air, turning the human body into a container with warmth leaking from every side. You may still be breathing. You may still be walking. But minute by minute, the machinery inside you is cooling down. The true enemy is not the rain itself. It is hypothermia. And you do not need to be trapped in a frozen wilderness for that danger to become real. A soaked body, a light wind, and a temperature of around 50 degrees Fahrenheit can create a serious emergency within hours. Even healthy people may struggle to endure more than 5 hours of cold rain. First, you begin to shiver. Then your fingers stiffen, making it nearly impossible to tie a cord, grip a stone, or start a fire. It is an excellent survival strategy assuming your goal is to lose the ability to do anything useful. The problem is that humans are tropical animals. We do not have the thick, water-resistant coats of wolves or bears. Our ancestors traded much of their body hair for the ability to sweat, which helped them run long distances beneath a hot sun. That sounds like a brilliant deal until the rain continues for days. Suddenly, bare skin becomes a terrible defense. So rather than waiting for evolution to grow the fur back, humans used their expanding brains to manufacture new skins of their own. But clothing alone was not enough. Survival still depended on fire, and an ancient fire was nothing like the lighter in your pocket. It was an entire system that had to be protected, fed, and watched day and night. Rubbing two damp pieces of wood together during the rainy season was close to impossible. Even moisture in the air could make tinder stubbornly refuse to ignite. If the fire died during a stormy night, a family could lose its heat, light, cooked food, and protection all at once. Here is where things get interesting. When a storm arrived, ancient humans did not always struggle to keep the flames burning high. They did the opposite. They buried glowing embers beneath a thick layer of ash. The ash acted like armor, limiting moisture while trapping heat underneath. The visible fire disappeared, but the coals could continue smoldering for around 12 hours. Once the rain weakened, someone could uncover an ember, add dry tinder, and blow gently. A fire that seemed completely dead would suddenly return to life. But what happened when the group had to move? Humans developed a kind of biological lighter using Fomes fomentarius, a hoof-shaped fungus that grows on trees. Its inner material could catch a weak spark and carry a smoldering ember for hours, even in damp air. The carrier only had to shield it from direct rain. Otzi, the famous man who lived more than 5,000 years ago, carried this fungus as part of his survival kit. Apparently, our ancestors had portable power banks too. Theirs just happened to smell like mushrooms, and that was only part of the solution. In a soaked forest, an experienced firekeeper did not bend down and collect branches from the ground. Those pieces had absorbed water like sponges. Instead, people looked upward for dead limbs still caught in the trees, partly protected by the canopy. They could split away the damp outer wood and reach the drier core inside. Even more valuable was fat wood, resin-rich wood that could burn fiercely despite the moisture surrounding it. The real treasure, however, was birch bark. It contains betulin, a substance that gives the surface a natural resistance to water. Even during a rainstorm, the bark could still catch fire because its oils were not easily ruined by moisture. People could use it as tinder, shape it into temporary coverings, or wrap it around glowing embers during travel. Think about that for a moment. In the middle of a drenched forest stood a tree that practically came equipped with waterproof paper and its own supply of fuel. Of course, even the best techniques sometimes failed. A fire could be extinguished. The final ember could become soaked. And suddenly, an entire group faced the possibility of freezing. When that happened, they might travel to a neighboring community and ask for fire. The surprising part is that even rival groups may have shared their embers, because everyone understood that the next rainy season could reverse their positions. A single glowing coal became a promise of cooperation. Before money, before roads, and perhaps before formal diplomacy, humans were already building relationships by making sure one another's fires never went out. Keeping the fire alive did not mean everyone could finally sleep. During long, rain-soaked nights, someone had to wake up, check the wind, shield the embers, and make sure water was not blowing into the hearth. Scientists call this the sentinel effect. Within a group, there is almost always at least one person awake. As one person falls asleep, another begins to stir. So that strange moment when you suddenly wake at 4 in the morning may not be entirely pointless. It could be an echo of ancestors who once guarded the fire so everyone else would still be alive by sunrise. But a fire could survive only if it was built in the right place. Deep inside a cave, smoke would collect until the air became dangerous. Too close to the entrance, and a sudden gust or burst of rain could extinguish the flames in seconds. Over generations, people discovered a sweet spot close enough to the entrance for smoke to escape, yet far enough inside to remain protected. Archaeologists have found thick layers of ash accumulating in the same locations, suggesting that generation after generation made the same careful choice. Fire did not just need fuel, it needed architecture. And when water began creeping into the shelter, our ancestors became some of the world's first drainage engineers. They dug shallow trenches around sleeping areas, guiding rainwater away instead of watching mud rise around their feet. Some groups also raised their beds with branches, dry grass, or flat stones. This kept their bodies away from the cold ground, reduced contact with mud and bacteria, and helped bedding remain dry. A narrow ditch may not sound revolutionary until it is the only thing stopping your shelter from becoming a pond full of people. Of course, caves were not available everywhere. In those places, humans had to build and carry their own patch of dry sky. In what is now Ukraine, people constructed shelters from enormous mammoth bones, arranging them into domed frames and covering them with animal hides. The hides were sewn and layered closely together to block rain, trap warmth, and keep out the wind. The curved structure distributed weight efficiently, while the ground beneath provided natural insulation. These homes may look primitive to us, but they solved essentially the same problems as a modern tent. Here is where the roof becomes interesting. People realized that the steeper the roof, the faster rainwater ran off, and the less time it had to seep inside. Leaves, grass, and bark were layered like fish scales, allowing water to slide from one surface to the next. They did not need equations to understand gravity. They simply watched what happened. A flat roof could quickly become a swimming pool. A steep one sent the water away before it caused trouble. Sometimes architecture begins with the simple desire not to have rain dripping onto your face while you sleep. In places that flooded regularly, however, even a steep roof was not enough. Across widely separated regions from Southeast Asia to Europe, people independently arrived at the same solution: raise the entire house above the ground. Wooden posts were driven deep into the mud, supporting homes above the waterline. When you cannot stop the water from rising, the logical answer is to live above it. More importantly, these raised homes protected seeds, dried meat, and firewood from soaking through and rotting. They were not only saving themselves, they were protecting the winter ahead. Leaving the shelter was still a problem. A loose animal hide thrown over the shoulders could flap open in the wind, allowing rain to pour inside. Then bone needles changed everything. Humans began sewing hides into fitted clothing that wrapped around the arms, legs, and torso. Tight seams trapped a thin layer of warm air close to the skin, creating natural insulation. Clothing lice, which evolved to live specifically in garments, suggest that humans may have worn clothing regularly more than 100,000 years ago. An incredibly annoying parasite turned out to be surprisingly useful archaeological evidence. But every stitch created tiny holes where water could seep through. Neanderthals addressed this problem with birch bark tar, a resin produced by heating birch bark in a low-oxygen environment. That may sound simple until you remember they were doing it roughly 200,000 years ago, without thermometers, industrial ovens, or written instructions. The resulting material was durable, water-resistant, and slow to decay. It could be used to attach tools, bond materials, and possibly seal weak points in animal hides. It was one of the earliest synthetic materials ever created by humans. Animal hide itself had another unpleasant flaw. Once it became wet and dried again, it could turn stiff, cracked, and almost wooden. Our ancestors solved this by rubbing the hide with animal brain tissue. The fats worked their way into the collagen fibers, helping the material remain soft, flexible, and more resistant to moisture. After being stretched, worked by hand, and smoked, the finished hide could make water bead and slide across the surface instead of soaking deeply into it. It sounds strange, but humans have always had a talent for turning unappealing materials into remarkable technology. At this point, it is practically a tradition. In the Arctic, Inuit communities pushed this idea even further. They cleaned seal intestines, stretched them into thin membranes, and carefully stitched them into extremely light waterproof garments. The material had evolved to function inside a marine animal, so water could barely pass through it. The seams were made with extraordinary precision, creating clothing that performed much like modern waterproof technical fabrics. And think about what that means. Without factories or industrial chemicals, people did not simply surrender to the environment. They studied the properties of every available material and transformed bone, hide, tree resin, and animal membranes into a complete survival system. But even if people managed to stay warm and dry, another threat was quietly growing: hunger. During long stretches of rain, large animals often retreated deep into the forest, tracks became harder to follow, and hunting grew far more dangerous. So humans turned to smaller, more dependable foods. Fish trapped in pools left behind by floods could be caught by hand or with short spears. Soft ground made starchy roots easier to dig up. After heavy rain, winged termites and other insects emerged in huge numbers, offering a valuable source of protein. It was hardly a luxurious menu, but in a survival situation, the best meal is usually the one already sitting in front of you. And this was one of humanity's greatest advantages. We could eat almost anything. Instead of depending entirely on elephants, deer, or wild horses, our ancestors learned to use snails, fish, frogs, insects, roots, and forest fruit. The rainy season was no longer simply a time when hunting stopped. It created an entirely different food system. Flexible groups could change their diet as soon as the environment changed. Those that depended too heavily on a single kind of prey were far more vulnerable. In nature, the survivor is not always the strongest. Sometimes, it is simply the least picky eater. But could humans really live for generations inside a dense tropical rainforest? For years, researchers assumed these environments were too wet, too tangled, and too lacking in large game to support ancient human communities. Then caves in Sri Lanka revealed a different story. Around 45,000 years ago, people there were making small bone hunting points to target monkeys and squirrels high in the canopy. Traces preserved in teeth and bones suggest that they relied on rainforest resources for thousands of years. A landscape once imagined as a wall blocking human migration turned out to be a home. Rain also gave hunters an unexpected gift: mud. That may not sound impressive until you see a fresh animal track pressed sharply into soft ground. From its depth, size, and spacing, a skilled tracker could estimate the animal's weight, whether it was walking or running, and how recently it had passed. Broken branches, skid marks, and splashes of mud continued the trail. After a storm, the ground became an enormous open book. The only problem was that it had no written words, and reading it incorrectly could make you someone else's dinner. But rain did more than reshape a single hunt. At times, it redrew the map of the world. During periods known as pluvials, increased rainfall transformed deserts into green landscapes. The Arabian Peninsula once held deep lakes, broad grasslands, and even populations of hippos. These green corridors opened routes that allowed human groups to move between Africa and Asia. When the rains came, the desert became a bridge. When the climate dried again, the vegetation vanished and those routes closed. Rain did not merely determine whether people survived. It helped decide where humanity could go. Then, eventually, the skies dried up. Lakes shrank, rivers disappeared, and green landscapes returned to dust. At that point, the secret to survival was hidden beneath the ground. Rainwater from years earlier had seeped through the soil and collected inside underground rock layers. Volcanic rock could act like an enormous natural filter, storing water and releasing it slowly through reliable springs. Groups that understood the landscape settled near these sources instead of depending entirely on rainfall. The sky could be unpredictable. Geology was often far more patient. Surviving cold rain, however, required more than finding shelter. When hypothermia becomes severe, the brain can begin working against the body it is supposed to protect. Some victims suddenly feel intensely hot and begin removing their clothing, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. Blood vessels near the skin lose their ability to remain constricted, allowing warm blood to rush outward and creating a false sensation of heat. A person in extreme danger may become convinced that they are overheating. It sounds like a cruel joke, except it is not. Living in a group meant others could recognize the behavior, stop the person from undressing, and move them closer to warmth. But days trapped inside caves did more than create boredom. They created time. When hunting was impossible, people repaired tools, ground ochre into pigment, and recreated the animals they had seen outside. Across the stone walls, shapes began to move. Bison charging, horses turning their heads, and human hands appearing in flickering firelight. Many of these images were made deep inside caves, beyond the reach of rain and sunlight. The weather forced people to stop, and in that pause, imagination had room to step forward. Then the images became stories. Around the fire, adults spoke about hidden water sources, safe routes, migrating herds, and lands that had once disappeared beneath floods. Children did not have to face every danger themselves in order to learn how to survive. They could inherit knowledge through stories, songs, and the memories of others. In many hunter-gatherer societies, fireside conversations have centered heavily on storytelling and the sharing of experience. Legends of great floods may have preserved memories of real disasters, passed from one generation to the next long before writing existed. And this may be the most important part of the entire story. No one survived alone. One person could not guard the fire, repair the roof, sew clothing, gather fuel, care for children, and hunt for food at the same time. Communities had to divide the work. Skilled trackers searched for animals. Expert hands repaired garments. Older members remembered the locations of springs, the seasons when certain plants produced fruit, and the strategies that had worked during earlier storms. Caring for the elderly and vulnerable was not only an act of compassion, it also protected living libraries of survival knowledge. In the end, humanity's most powerful weapon was not the spear. It was the ability to share what we knew. Surviving one rainy season did not mean the problem was solved. The rains would return, so humans began preparing while the sky was still clear. Dry seeds were stored above the ground, meat was preserved near the fire, and good firewood was collected before the soil turned to mud. People carried fire-making kits containing spark stones, dry bark, ember-carrying fungus, and tinder. This was no longer a last-minute reaction. It was strategic thinking. Rain forced humans to stop living entirely in the present and begin imagining dangers that had not happened yet. And that may explain a feeling many of us still recognize today. You are lying in a warm room while rain taps steadily against the roof, and somehow, instead of feeling threatened, you feel calm. Some people call this feeling crystalism. The comfort of watching bad weather from a safe, sheltered place. The steady sound of rain may reduce alertness in the nervous system and soften the stress response of the amygdala, the part of the brain constantly scanning for danger. But here is the interesting part. Maybe your brain does not love rain at all. Maybe it loves the fact that the rain is outside and you are not. Every drop striking a metal roof or window pane may be recreating an ancient emotion. Relief. The fire is still burning. The clothing is still dry. Water is not pouring into the sleeping area. People who felt rewarded by a secure shelter may have been more likely to remain there, repair the roof, deepen the drainage channels, and protect their fuel. That sounds obvious, but history is often built from obvious actions repeated at exactly the right time. Our nervous systems are still listening to the weather. The difference is that now they are doing it from behind glass. Human history, then, is not only a story of great hunts and dramatic migrations. Much of it may have been nothing more glamorous than soaked people struggling to keep a pile of embers alive. we never truly conquered the rain. We learned to redirect water, preserve heat, and move with its rhythms. Rain helped shape clothing, roofs, food storage, and the division of labor within communities. Civilization was not built from stone alone, it was also built during cold nights when people moved closer together and shared their warmth. But the memory of water was preserved in more than tools. It also entered mythology. From Greece to India, many cultures tell stories of catastrophic floods, surviving boats, and birds released to search for dry land. Those similarities raise an intriguing question. Were these stories simply products of imagination, or did they preserve collective memories of real floods? Different communities may have survived different disasters, then transformed their fear into stories that could be passed down for generations. Each one carries the same warning. Nature does not care how much humanity has managed to build. Over time, the small trenches dug around sleeping areas grew into drainage systems for entire cities. At Mohenjo-Daro, part of the Indus Valley civilization, people constructed networks of baked brick drains around 4,000 years ago. Controlling water was no longer the responsibility of a single family. It had become a shared obligation of society. The same basic ideas raising floors, guiding water away, and protecting food stores are still used in flood-prone regions today. Technology changes, but water keeps asking the same question. Are you prepared? Today, scientists are returning to ancient caves with tools our ancestors could never have imagined. From a single handful of soil, sediment DNA can reveal genetic traces left by the humans and animals that once lived there. Layers of mud can show when water entered a cave, while charcoal and ash reveal where fires burned and how long they may have lasted. Every grain of earth becomes a fragment of memory. A shelter that appears silent is actually preserving traces of rain, footsteps, and desperate nights of survival from tens of thousands of years ago. And all of this leads to one simple truth. Humans were never the strongest animals. We had no claws, no waterproof fur, and no extraordinary resistance to cold. What we had was the ability to prepare and cooperate. Groups that failed to preserve fire, store food, or share knowledge may have disappeared without leaving a trace. You, meanwhile, are descended from people who protected their flames through thousands of rainy seasons. Think about that for a moment. Your existence began with countless people who remembered to cover one small ember before going to sleep. Yet rain was never only an enemy. It also carried life. The annual flooding of the Nile deposited fertile soil, helping ancient Egypt build one of the greatest civilizations in history. Once people learned to anticipate the water, dig canals, and plant according to the seasons, fear slowly became respect. The same floods that could destroy homes also fed entire cities. Rain created crises, but it also watered the first seeds of agriculture and permanent settlement. In the end, the story of surviving endless rain is not really about animal hide clothing, fire-carrying fungus, or shelters built from mammoth bones. It is about finding light when everything around you is cold and dark. Beneath the thunder, our ancestors still sang, told stories, painted cave walls, and cared for those who were weaker. You still carry the legacy of those hide workers, firekeepers, and rainforest hunters. So the next time you sit in a dry room and listen to the rain outside, look at the roof a little differently. That ordinary warmth is the result of tens of thousands of years of humans refusing to let the fire go out.